by Dana Gibbet. Hang on, let me check the box here. What we'd like to do is obviously we'll be talking about the college area community plan update, but one of the things we'd like to emphasize tonight, because I think it's an underlying significant part of this whole plan, is kind of where, what's driving the significant upzoning that's involved in this plan. So first, let me show the actual plans that were proposed by the city. There's what they called and to kind of back up, we had we referenced it earlier as to Tom Silva. There was an earlier planning document, a report, that was generated within the community that did talk about, in effect, densifying the corridors, creating sort of nodes in certain areas. And a lot of what was in the plan, talked about, business development, such as co-working sites. And, one of the things I think is really important is that planning is even though we try and reduce it to numbers and make it a mechanical process, really it's a human process, and it's how we define how we're going to relate to each other and the environment around us. And so, I think the document that was produced before was very mindful of those concepts and tried to capture those, whereas what the city did was, we've got this driving force, which is our regional housing needs assessment that says we need to get so many units built, and that drives the city to effectively upzone just about everywhere they do a community plan update, without really thinking about, is everything going to be built to the new zoning standards, or be realistic in terms of those expectations. So as Jeffrey pointed out earlier, there were really two plans that were presented. There was what's called the Grand Boulevard Plan, which, it does indeed, and both of these do, concentrate the highest density along the corridors. I apologize, the legend's hard to read, but these purple zones are 7 to 9 stories. The red zones are 5 to 7 stories, and then it steps down in these brown areas to 3 to 5 stories. And then as you get into where they've basically rezone the single family zones, the RS17 zones, to higher density, those are zoned for townhouses, which is 2 to 3 stories. So, I'm sure people who live in this area can see where they are relative to this map, and see that, in particular, what's happening is, kind of a push here all the way to Adams to convert to townhouses along this east-west axis, basically also removing all single-family zoning from this triangle here between Montezuma, El Cajon, and College. And then, of course, and this is already a pretty heavy mini dorm area already, but, basically converting Mary Jane Place and the areas immediately adjacent to the college as well. So, so this is option one. The second option they presented was do the same but more. So, I think to the comment earlier, do you want even more zoning or less zoning? The 15-minute neighborhood here, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. It's a very popular term in the planning world. And to know what it means in reality is that a 15-minute neighborhood is, subtracting out, going to work. A 15-minute neighborhood is, can you, live a significant part of your life within a 15-minute walk of where you live. So that's, restaurants, shopping, and certain types of commercial activities. It could be work but, as we know, you don't pick up and move every time you change jobs. So sometimes saying, we want to connect work to that is more challenging. Certainly saying that we're going to take this amount of the current neighborhood, the college area, making this 3 to 4 stories, 3 to 4 stories, 3 to 4 stories, basically going all the way down Baja at 3 to 4 stories. And this intersection at Callwood and Montezuma is significant because they went 5 to 7 stories. And, you know, one of the things I always wonder, and it gets back to the original comment, is does somebody just build these plans by looking at a map, or does somebody actually drive and realize, you know, that there's some pretty steep canyons and they're pretty restricted? And if you're talking about a 15-minute neighborhood, which is a walking neighborhood, going up a very steep grade like Callwood to get to Elkhorn Boulevard, you know, some of those things aren't really very mindful of the philosophical concept of it. We can come back to this if people have questions, but the thing I really wanted to emphasize is, again, we do a mindful job of building a community plan. And a lot of these are built around what's called the regional needs housing adequate sites inventory. And you can see when the city responded to its housing element, it said that we are going to develop our transit and commercial corridors as a priority to meet our housing goals of 108,000 in the next 8 years through community plan updates in this adequate sites inventory. The city has now identified 175,000. So from a planning standpoint, we think that we've identified enough areas to meet the housing needs of San Diego. And so, you know, that brings into question what is the necessity to do further upzoning away from those transit corridors and away from where you would have critical mass for commercial development and so on. And I'll turn it over to Dana. The other part of this is there's these housing projections that HCD used to generate the RENA numbers. Those have started to get audited, and they found discrepancies. You know, you may be aware that you know the entire country is said to be 3.5 million homes short of what it needs, and California is saying it's 3 million of those 3.5 million. So there's some questions anyway. But the good news is the city, or at least Sandag, has started to revise its estimates for population based on the reality that just demographically, we're not going to keep growing forever as a state or as a country or as a world. And we're going to eventually flatten out with about somewhere between 1.6 and 1.7 million residents in California. And that we should be taking those assumptions into consideration when we do our zoning and our community plan updates, because zoning for Manhattan and not getting it means you're going to get a lot of sparse and dysfunctional development that takes place because of that. Dana, do you want to talk about kind of these Sandag comparison numbers?
Yeah. So the important point here is that when the college area plans were begun and the population numbers were based on Sandag Series 13 data. That's what the City of San Diego Planning Department used, okay? So those are the numbers in red on the charts. And those were based on 2012 data. We are very fortunate, it's 2022, and Sandag has just published their Series 14 data. So we have new numbers, and they are based on very recent projections by the California Department of Finance, which reflects the slowed growth that Jeff was just talking about. So what we see for the college area is not the 95% growth that was projected between 2020 and 2050. But now Sandag is looking for the same 30-year time period, they're looking at a 35% growth rate. So a little more than a third of what the planning department is producing were projected for. So that's a huge difference. And that's one that we will discuss with Nathan Cosman and the planning department when we have the opportunity to speak with them. But it is a significant difference. It's 15,260 less people than what they were planning for. So that would be less households needed, less housing units. Can we go to the next slide, please, Jeff? So there are still more housing units than population because there is a backlog of housing over time. But the planning department was projecting that we needed 130% increase based on the Series 13 data from 2012 in the college area specifically. And now Sandag has lowered that, and we're looking at a 59% increase, or over 4,000 less housing units than they were looking at for us to produce. And if I could share my screen for a minute, there's something else I wanted to show. Can I do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So before the three plans that, the two plans that Jeff showed you, and I want to tell you that the only reason we have pictures of those plans is because I took screenshots of them at the February 23rd meeting. And it's not because I want to be a hero, but it's because the city has a tendency not to share information. And I thought we should have them. And so I had the foresight to take pictures of them. Otherwise, we still wouldn't have them. But in the meeting, the previous plans that the city had presented to this subcommittee involved these three plans called the corridors, the nodes, and the districts. And I wanted to show you this because at that time, they were planning for roughly 71% to a 78% increase in the number of households, or housing units, we'll call them, that would be required. And what I just showed you said that over 30 years between 2020 and 2050, we're only looking at the need of an increase of 59%. So these plans, which do not generally show the encroachment into the neighborhoods that you saw in the Grand Boulevards plan and the 15-minute neighborhoods plan, this one specifically has 78% more housing units than what we saw in those, in what we have now, sorry. And we only need 59% according to the new Sandag numbers. I have asked Nathan, as soon as I saw those plans, I wrote to him and I said, how many more households are you projecting? And what percent of the single family houses and what number of houses are you wiping out with these plans? And we have yet to have answers to those. But as you can see, we can keep most of these single family neighborhoods that were wiped out in those other plans and still provide the 59% increase in households that are required for growth over the next 30 years. So I'll stop sharing now and give it back to Jeff.
Great. And then just to finish up, I think people know it already based on the earlier conversations, but go to www.plancollegearea.org, get signed up for the updates when that's working and when they're available. And then we've talked about it already. There's this report that was generated earlier. Whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, I think it's a good sense of understanding at least the issues and the considerations that should go into a plan. And plans are about a lot more than just housing. They're about economic development. They're about commercial development. They're about public improvements like parks and libraries. There's, bike lanes. There's everything in it that allow us to have a more livable a neighborhood and a community. And frankly, our position is density should have certain benefits that can come with it if it's done right and mindfully. And we just need to push for that as members of the community. And one of the things that's very, very important is, and it's particularly difficult when we get these inappropriate processes where they just say, well, we threw everything away and we gave you, bad and worse as your two choices. That being said, in a rightful planning process, you would have the ability to say not just what you don't want, but what you do want. And, as members of a community, think about what you can say yes to, not just, what you think is, excessive and egregious. And with that, I will stop. That's a topic for another day, but I think that also gets into the affordability. And if you want to go to our website, it's neighbors4abettersandiego.org, and you can email us at betterforsd@gmail.com. So I'll stop there and go ahead and take any questions.
Great,
Yep.
thank you, Jeff.
Jeff, can I just say, somebody asked if we could